I am now.
Yes.
Nice.
We're getting into Genesis 4 to 11. Welcome if you're on the recording, and we're just about to brainstorm some of the major events in Genesis 4 to 11. What jumps out for you?
Cain kills Abel.
Cain kills Abel. You can open a Bible and scan through.
The flood.
The flood.
Yeah.
That's a whole.
The Nephilim.
The Nephilim, yes. Beginning of chapter 6 there.
The Tower of Babel.
The Tower of Babel. They're really the big ones, aren't they? Cain kills Abel in terms of narrative. The flood and Noah, and there's the Tower of Babel. Three major narratives in this part of the story. And what else is taking up the space then? It's genealogies, isn't it? And so we're going to need to talk about the flow of the genealogies and then the way in which these narratives punctuate the genealogies. But first, we're going to put on our historical lens and think about Genesis 4 to 11 in historical perspective, and then we'll work our way through it before drawing out some of the biblical theological themes that are here and how they're developed across the rest of Scripture. So with our historical lens on, we come first to the flood narrative in Genesis 6 to 9, because this is where we do have some very significant parallels in other ancient Near Eastern texts. And again, we meet the Atrahasis epic and the Gilgamesh epic. I mentioned both of these yesterday. On the notes there, you can see a picture of tablet 11 of the Gilgamesh epic, which is in cuneiform script. You can go and see that in the British Museum. Stuff the British Stole there's a documentary by that name, I think, and there's quite a lot of it in the British Museum, but well preserved for us. So if you're ever in London, make sure you do get along to the British Museum and see some of this stuff. When you study the flood narrative in the Gilgamesh epic or in the Atrahasis epic, these are both from Mesopotamia. That's the land between the rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. You find that they have some striking similarities with the flood story we know from Genesis 6 to 9. So Wenham lists them like this on the lecture notes on page 1. The God or the gods decide to destroy humankind. God or the gods warn the flood hero. God or the gods command the flood hero to build an ark. The hero obeys. God or the gods command the hero to enter the ark. The hero and those with him enter. The door is closed. The flood comes. Life is destroyed. The rain ends and the ark grounds on a mountain. The hero opens a window. He sends birds out to survey the land. The hero and those with him exit the ark. The hero makes a sacrifice. God or the gods smell the sacrifice and then bless the flood hero. And when you lay them out like that, it seems pretty clear, doesn't it, that we're telling the same story. There's just too many similarities for these to be different stories. We're telling the same story. There seems to be a common memory, a common understanding of a real historical event. So I shouldn't say common understanding, a common memory of a real historical event. What there is not is a common understanding. And that's what I've got in the next paragraph there, because each of these accounts gives its own theological interpretation of the events of the flood. And that's where they differ, and very significantly. So the God of Genesis 6 to 9 is completely unlike the gods in the Mesopotamian accounts. And there's a number of things that stand out about the Mesopotamian accounts. First of all, again, they're polytheistic, while Genesis 6 to 9 is fiercely monotheistic. And that underpins a number of other differences. So, for example, in the Mesopotamian accounts, the decision to send the flood is taken in the divine council where the gods meet, but it's not unanimous. And so the god Ea dissents from the decision, and you should never do this if you're on a council where you're in the minority and the majority vote one way and you vote the other way. Once you leave the room, you hold to the decision of the council, right? That's just good polity. Everyone knows that. Except not the god Ea, who left the council and went and warned his favorite human, Utnapishtim, who's the Noah figure in the Mesopotamian accounts. He warns him about the coming deluge. And so there's a leak from the divine council. Second, and very significant difference, is the way in which the divine council is held in order to deal with the problem of humanity on the earth, which is not their wickedness, as we read in Genesis 6 but they're noise. The gods are annoyed at the humans who are making too much noise in their space. Third, then, once the floods have been unleashed, the gods in these accounts are powerless to control them. They cower like dogs before the waters as they're rising. So they unleash the power of the waters, but then they're powerless in the face of it. And then finally, at least in the Gilgamesh epic, after the waters secede and Utnapishtim offers sacrifice, the gods crowd around the sacrifice like flies, which seems to imply that they've been going hungry because there's been no food available during the flood. So that gives you a flavour for the theological differences, and it puts some flesh perhaps on the bones of what I said yesterday about the gods and goddesses in polytheistic myths are really just like big humans on steroids. They're human beings who are capable of being afraid of the waters and who get hungry when there's not enough food, and who can unleash a power but then find it out of their control. And of course, the God of the Bible is not like that at all. He sends the flood not because human beings are noisy and annoying him, but because they're multiplying wickedness and violence and ruining the good world that he made. Once he's unleashed the floods, he's not powerless in the face of the waters, but has full power and control over them. And so, although we've got these similarities, which are significant enough to say we're dealing with the same story, we've also got very different theological interpretations of the stories coming through in the different accounts. And we can say the same kind of thing about the Tower of Babel over on the next page, where we don't have the same direct parallel with any particular narrative, but the Enuma Elish from Babylon does refer to the construction of the city of Babylon and its temple, and in particular refers to these ziggurat temples. I've given you a picture of one there, which dotted the landscape. And in the Enuma Elish, they're described as being so majestic and tall that they have their tops in the heavens. And that phrase is very similar to the way in which the Tower of Babel is described in Genesis 11, of course. And so as Wenham puts it, Genesis 11 may well be mocking Babylonian boasts about their temples. Their fancy brickwork and their vaunted height are something to laugh at, because God, of course, has to come down from the heights of heaven to see this great temple that the people are building. So Babylon shows man's folly, not his wisdom, says Wenham, man's impotence before the judgment of God. And there's another similarity that we can draw attention to with ancient Near Eastern mythology and culture, which has a common tradition about an ancient golden age where everyone spoke the same language. And the best example of that's in a Sumerian epic, En-Merkar and the Lord of Arata, which speaks back to a time when the whole universe and the people in unison to Enlil, one of the gods, in one tongue spoke. And then we have a rival god, Enki, who changed the speech in their mouths and brought it into contention, into the speech of man that until then had been one. And so there you've got the explanation for the diversity of language in the world as the result of rivalry between the gods. Everyone's speaking one language and worshipping Enlil, and Enki doesn't like that, so he confuses their language in order that they might worship, at least some of the people might worship him. So again, we've got a similar kind of memory of the diversification of languages, and yet a very different theological interpretation, which is driven by the polytheism of the myth, one god in competition with another, rather than the monotheism that we have in Genesis 11, where it's the one true and living God, the creator, who confuses the languages in judgment because of sin. So it's worth being aware of these. Again, I find these parallels really interesting, and particularly interesting because of what they highlight about the biblical account. It helps you to see what's unique in the ancient context, and therefore what is being taught through these accounts about God and his interactions with the world. So any questions or comments about those brief observations on the historical context of these major stories in Genesis 4 to 11?
It seems like there's quite a lot of, I don't know, maybe it's just the way you presented it, but do the three that you've mentioned seem to, or four, is it, they seem to have quite a lot of cohesiveness between them? They use the same god names, they use the same hero. Are they a lot more cohesive?
Yes, so the two Mesopotamian accounts both have Utnapishtim as for the flood narratives. So yes, there is cohesiveness between them. Not at every point, and also they're fragmentary, so we don't have the whole story from both of them, and so we're kind of piecing it together. But yes, they come from a common origin. They're both at least the Atrahasis epic and the Gilgamesh epic are both Mesopotamian, from the land between the rivers, and from around the same age. And so they may just be different versions of the same cultural account.
Hi, Christian. Do you have any thoughts on, or brief comments, perhaps on worldwide versus local flood?
Yeah, it's a difficult one. The account as you read it seems to imply worldwide. The earth is covered with the waters. And so I think that's the most straightforward reading of it. The challenge really is that we're here in the very beginnings of life on Earth. And how far in the past are we is something that's very difficult to be certain about. And so how similar is the geography? Where's plate tectonics up to at this point when we're dealing with the story of the flood? And so I think the most straightforward reading of it seems to be that it's a worldwide flood. Certainly the New Testament seems to read it as a worldwide flood. I think that's probably the way in which I tend to read it, though I'm not sure there's anything that hangs on it absolutely or necessarily being a worldwide flood. And so you could make arguments that it's a localized flood on the basis of things like the recognition of the word land or earth, eretz in Hebrew, does have a wide range of meaning. It doesn't always mean the globe. In fact, often it's used to mean the land of Israel, Eretz Israel. They still use it today, actually, Israelis, to talk about the land of Israel. And certainly in the Bible, Eretz, the word that's often translated land or earth, can be a localized part of the earth. So the impression we get in English when we see the word earth, we think globe. It doesn't necessarily have to be translated that way. You can translate it more narrowly. So people make arguments on that kind of basis for a localized flood. But I think still the most natural reading is of a worldwide flood, particularly when we get to passages like 2 Peter 3, which we'll look at in a little bit when we get to the biblical theological section. The flood is a parallel for the judgment that's coming on all the world at the end by fire. And so again, that would seem to imply a worldwide flood. Okay, when we get to the just working through the account, taking off our historical lens and putting on a literary lens, let me give you first an overview of Genesis 4 to 11, and then we'll focus in on the account of the flood and Babel. And really what we need to notice, especially in Genesis 4 to 11, is that we've got these twin themes of the spread of sin and of God's gracious preservation of his people. And you've got those two things operating in parallel throughout these accounts. The spread of sin there is obvious. It begins with Cain, Adam, Genesis 4:11. Let me put some of this on the screen. Adam made love to his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. And so immediately out of the Adam and Eve story, we come into their children. And within, about 10 verses, we've got the first murder. And so already we sense there's a kind of escalation in sin in the second generation, where Adam and Eve rebel against God by eating from the fruit of the tree about which God commanded them they shall not eat. Their children are murdering each other. And so Cain deceives it or misleads his brother. Let's go out to the field with a seemingly innocent request there in verse 8. But while they're in the field, Cain attacks his brother and kills him, and then denies any responsibility. When the Lord says to Cain, "Where's your brother Abel?" "I don't know," he replies, lying. "Am I my brother's keeper?" And so we sense an escalation in sin here. And that certainly seems to be confirmed by the end of chapter 4, where we come to Lamech, who marries 2 women, one named Ada and the other Zillah, and then boasts about the murder that he's committed. Lamech said to his wives, 4:23, "Ada and Zillah, listen to me, wives of Lamech, hear my words. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. And here he is boasting about the way in which his murder exceeds that of Cain. And so very quickly, we're plunged into not only the spread of sin, but the escalation of sin, and especially violent sin in the world. So this is a theme that's developing through these chapters. And then when we get to chapter 5 in the genealogy, this is the genealogy of Adam's line, the written account of Adam's family line. I've got, for whatever reason, the NIV up there today. Yesterday I had the ESV. I find myself always switching between the two and others. There's the ESV again. This is the book of the generations of Adam. There's that Tolle dot formula. And when we get to this genealogy, you can't miss the repetition of the life and death pattern. Right? The days of Adam after he fathered Seth for 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days that Adam lived for 930 years, and he died. And Seth lived 105 years, and he fathered Enosh. And Seth lived after he fathered Enosh 807 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Seth for 912 years, and he died. And so we keep going, and he died, and he died, and he died. It's like a roll call of death. And in the context of Genesis 2, where God's promise was that if you eat from the tree about which I've commanded you, then in the day you eat of it, you'll surely die. And then the announcement of that judgment in chapter 3, dust you are and to dust you will return. We can't help but understand here that this repeated death of each and every single one of the descendants of Adam is the curse of sin working its way out in the world. And so we've got the escalation of sin and the ongoing curse of sin, except, of course, for Enoch. I said each and every one. I should have given the exception of Enoch, who lived 65 years and walked with God. And he breaks the pattern. We don't get that note for any of them. The others live, but Enoch walks with God. That's a different kind of life after he'd fathered Methuselah. And so all the days of Enoch were 365 years, and he walked with God, emphasized again, and he was not, for God took him. It's enigmatic and mysterious, but the thing to notice is that he doesn't die. He's taken to fellowship with God after his walking with God on earth. He continues to walk with God, we presume, in the afterlife, and he's therefore given freedom from death. And what that does is it highlights for us the possibility that although sin is spreading and sin is escalating and death is the inevitable result, there's also a way out. God is able to overcome sin and death. And for those who walk with God, sin and death won't be the last word or have the final say. And so we've got these twin themes of sin spreading, but God's grace continuing. And the grace is there not only in the standout example of Enoch, but in the fact that children keep being born. That's what's the other thing that's emphasized in these genealogies, is not just that each and every one of them dies apart from Enoch, but that they live a certain number of years and they father children. And then the next generation lives. And in the context of Genesis 3:15, where we have the promise that the seed of the woman will crush the serpent's head, the new life of each generation raises our hopes that perhaps this one could be the one who's going to bring freedom from the curse of sin and death. And that's drawn to our attention again in Genesis 5:28, when Lamech, this is Lamech II, had lived 182 years. He fathered a son and called his name Noah, saying, "Out of the ground that the Lord has cursed," a deliberate echo of the cursing of the ground back in chapter 3. "This one shall bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands," again, alluding to the curse. And so here's Lamech speaking a word of hope that God is going to bring relief from the curse, and that his son Noah might be the seed of the woman who's going to crush the serpent's head. And so you can see we've got these twin ideas of the spread of sin and God's renewed and ongoing grace. And you get that then especially in the flood narratives and in the account of Babel. But let me give you a chance to make any comments or ask questions so far.
Was Lamech wrong?
Yes and no. In that God does bring a kind of relief through Noah. There is a cleansing judgment. That's how I'm going to talk about the flood. It's the salvation that comes through the judgment of the flood. And so there is a kind of relief, but it's not the full-orbed, final and complete relief that perhaps Lamech might have hoped for. And certainly it's not the full-orbed relief that comes later on, which we're still waiting for, actually, but begins with the coming of Christ. Okay, yeah, go for it.
Sorry, why do they live so long?
Yeah, that's a good question. Don't know. I've been reading through Genesis with my kids, and the two things they noticed in the genealogy here is, one, they're all dying, and two, why do they live so long? That really stands out. The best explanation I've got for that is that as sin is increasing, its effects gradually increase in the world as well. And so because we're in the early days of life on earth and the early days of the spread of sin, the effects of sin aren't as extreme as they eventually become. And so you do notice a pattern. It's not linear, but there is a tendency in the ages that they're gradually coming down. They live less by the end of the list than by the beginning of the list. Like I say, there's ups and downs, but the tendency is down. And then when we get to Genesis 6, we get a definite declaration from God where, am I in the right spot here? All the days of their earth will be 120 years. Where's that? That's
6:3.
6:3, thanks. That's what I'm thinking of. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for his flesh, his days shall be 120 years. So that's the best explanation I've got, is that sin has not yet taken its full effect, and therefore they're living longer, but the length of the lives are coming down until God eventually puts a limit on it. And so that leads us in. Yep, go for it.
Sorry. So with, like, because there's people who kind of trace the lineage and the timing of all that kind of stuff. How much can we trust, like, the exact timing of when this all takes place? Is it pretty accurate?
Yeah, so we don't get any absolute timing. What we get is relative timing, the age of each of them, but it's not tied to any absolute point, is it? So if you add up all the ages, and this was first done by Archbishop Usher, Anglican Archbishop in Ireland, around the time of the Westminster Assembly in the 1600s, and he arrived at the age of the earth, the creation being something like 4015 BC or something like that. That is, if you add up all these ages, then that's the time you get. And there's a few challenges with that. So one, if we go back all the way to Genesis 1, where we get, I said yesterday, Genesis 1:1 proper. This is creation proper right there. And then from Genesis 1:2, we have the ordering of creation. And there's no time indicators given there. And so for how long was the earth without form and void and darkness hovering over the face of the deep? Right, there's, for those who, like myself, see enough in the scientific evidence to say that we have an old earth, not a young earth. And that has to be said as majority even of conservative evangelical scholars. There's plenty of room there for billions of years, right? Because there's no time indicators given. And then similarly, when we get let there be light, and there was light, and God sees that there's light, and there was evening and there was morning the first day. Well, if we want to take a strictly literal 24-hour day reading of this, then this first day is a very strange day because there's no sun or moon or stars yet. Right? And so the day, as we understand it, a 24-hour day, relies on the rotation of the earth on its axis, which gives us a 24-hour day because the sun is shining on us. But here we see there's light, but there's no sun. That's not created until the fourth day. So how long is this first day? And why should we think that this first day is 24 hours? Right. So there's lots of mystery here. That's talking about the age of the earth, right? So I think there's plenty of room here for seeing an old earth because the account is not giving us any absolute timings. And so then when we get the genealogies, which is more the specific question that you're asking now, I think we take these years at face value, that this is how long these people lived. This is the record that Moses has given us. What Moses' sources are, we don't know, but there's a long tradition in biblical history of recording genealogies. And so I think we've got to assume that there's genealogies that have been passed down to Moses. But whether the genealogies are complete, whether we've got everyone in the genealogy or whether there are gaps in the genealogies, and whether we've got an ancestral tree here that names some of the key figures in the history of the world without necessarily giving us every single generation. I think that's an open question. And if you read it like that, then perhaps there's room here also for many more. Excuse me, I've just got something in my throat. There's room here for a longer period of time than might appear just from adding up the numbers. So the numbers for each individual, I think there's no reason to distrust that. Let's go with what we read. But let's also be, not too quick to think that what we've got here is everything there is to know. What we've got here is what God has given us to know. But there's much more in your philosophy, in heaven and earth, than there is in your philosophy, O Horatio, says Hamlet. And I think there's wisdom in that. We've got to keep reminding ourselves of the limitations of our knowledge. We know what's been revealed, which is far from everything there is to know. So that's a long-winded answer to a short question, but maybe gets us some way towards.
Is that how we should sort of generally see, like ancient genealogy is a bit more editorialized than we would be used to in sort of modern record keeping?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. I mean, you see that when you compare the genealogies of Jesus in Matthew and in Luke. Matthew arranges the genealogy in 3 sets of 14, and 14 is 2 times 7, so that's 7, 7, 7, 7, 7, 7, 6 sevens, and then that makes Jesus the 7th 7. So there's a deliberate arrangement of the genealogy there to make a theological point. Not saying it's inaccurate, but it's been arranged with a particular point in mind. Similarly, when you get to Luke, you get 76 individuals named, and Jesus is the 77th. And this is in God's there's 2 things going on there. There's God's providence in bringing it about that way, but there's also the choice of the gospel writers to arrange the genealogy in such a way that it makes the point that Jesus is the final Adam in both cases.
Yeah, cool.
So I of interest, I in the past have taken those genealogies at face value in terms of their times. And the interesting thing that I discovered was that Methuselah died just before the flood. Lamech, Noah's dad, either died in the flood or just before it. And Adam only died about 100 years before the flood. So if you take those, I mean, so after that, they're not so exact in terms of how long people lived and what age their kids were born. But those ones that do actually talk about their ages they're born and how old they were when they died. And it all kind of does actually fit together in terms of the wiping out of the generation at Noah's time.
Yeah, so maybe you can make a distinction between pre-flood and post-flood. All I'm saying is it's hard to be certain about what we're not being told. There may be more information that's not given to us. And certainly the ages, there's no reason to take them in any other way than with face value. And so, yeah, you can do that kind of exercise that you've done in adding them up together with the ages at which their children are born and the ages at which they die, and find these. One of the things that will do for you is emphasize, as you've just noticed, the significance of the flood as a judgment on those who lived at the time. When we come to Genesis 6 and the flood, we get this same kind of twin theme of both God's ongoing mercy and grace in the face of sin, and sin being multiplied on the earth and deserving God's judgment. So in Genesis 6 and verse 5, we get this stunning indictment of human life on earth. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. It's hard to think how you could put that any stronger. The wickedness is great. It's every intention. It's not only of behaviours outwardly, but it's of the thoughts of his heart, which are evil continually. And so humankind have degenerated by this point to such an extent that the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. And so God resolves to blot out man, who is created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things, again, allusion back to Genesis 1, and the birds of the heavens. But in the midst of that expansion of an escalation of sin and God's resolve to judge it, there's also, again, a sign of grace. But Noah found favour in the eyes of the Lord. And it's significant that that note comes before we have the indication in the next verse that Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. God finding favour with him comes first. And then we're told that he's righteous and blameless and walks with God. And so, again, we've got this emphasis in the midst of the spread of sin and God's judgment on it, of God's grace. And similarly, we have the same thing. We'll come back to the flood account in more detail in a minute. We have the same thing with the Tower of Babel, where the Tower of Babel is pictured as not a high point, but a low point in the spread of sin. And God brings judgment on the people. The Lord came down, verse 5, to see the city, and brings judgment by confusing their languages and disperses them across the face of the earth. And yet, immediately following that, we have the generations of Shem, who is one of the sons of Noah, the one whom Noah blesses. And so we pick up the hope that's been running the whole way through that, maybe we'll come now to the seed of the woman who's going to crush the serpent's head. And the repetition, here it is again, this Toledot formula, the generations formula, which keeps drawing our attention to that promise, the proto-evangelium in Genesis 3:15. And what's interesting about this renewed genealogy is there's no death noted. Of course, these people are dying, but we don't have that repetition of death, which gives us a sense of hope. Shem was 100 years old. He fathered Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. Shem lived after he fathered Arphaxad 500 years and had other sons and daughters, but no note of Shem's death. I think we have to presume that he does die, but it's not narrated for us. And so there's a lifting of that sense of the ongoing impact of the curse that we had prior to the flood in the genealogy beforehand. And so we're reading with hope, looking for the one through whom God is going to bring relief. And we keep reading through Shem's genealogy, and we come down to the next generations of Terah, and we're still looking, we're still hoping until finally we get to Abram. And when we get to Abram, in chapter 12, verse 3, we have this repetition of blessing. I'll make of you a great nation. I'll bless you. I'll make your name great, that you'll be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. And here we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 uses of the word bless, which takes us all the way back to Genesis 1. That was the Lord's first word. After God had created humankind in his image, the Lord blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. And so we got that echo of the blessing, but now amplified. One blessing becomes 5. And the 5 is probably particularly significant because in between the first blessing and these blessings, we've got 5 times the word curse occurs in Genesis 1 through to 11. The curse on the earth and the curse at the time of Noah. And so the repetition of the language there seems to be, again, deliberate, that the blessing of God precedes the curse and matches and overcomes the curse. And so that brings to a close this emphasis that I've been trying to draw attention to in Genesis 4 to 11 on the increasing spread of sin, the curse of death as a result, and yet in the midst of that, God's ongoing commitment to his world, God's ongoing grace and mercy, that's going to find a way to overcome the curse. There's the big picture in overview from Genesis 4 to 11. Any comments or questions there? Otherwise, we'll jump in and look at the flood in a little bit more detail. Okay, well, let's do that. Again, I've given you a diagram on page 5 of the notes, and let me put that on the screen in case that's easier as well. And in terms of the structure of the flood narrative, we've got the same kind of thing as we saw in Genesis 2 and 3. This is an extended chiasm, or sometimes you'll hear it called the palistrophe. Same thing, this A matches A1, B matches B1, C matches C1 kind of pattern, which draws our attention to what happens in the middle. And you can see the matching pairs here. We've got the introduction and the conclusion. And in 1 and 10, we've got violence in God's creation matched by God's covenant, blessing and peace. Then we've got in 2 and 9, God's resolve to destroy matched by God's resolve to preserve order. And 3 and 8, God commands Noah to enter the ark matched by God's command to Noah to leave the ark. And 4 and 7, the flood beginning matched by the earth drying, the floodwaters rising in 5 and 6 matched by the floodwaters receding. And that takes us to the very center, which is in Genesis 8. Which is the main thing we need to notice in this narrative. That's how these chiasms work. And in Genesis 8:1, we read that God remembered Noah in the midst of his judgment on the earth because of sin. Noah, who found favor in God's sight, Genesis 6, Noah, who was blameless in his generation and who walked with God. God remembered Noah and all the beasts and the livestock that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind blow over the earth and the waters subsided. And so we get a turning point and the beginning of the end of the flood. And this language of God remembering Noah is particularly significant. It's the first time it occurs in the Old Testament, but it then recurs a number of times. And so we get to God remembering Abraham in Genesis 19:29 in the midst of the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah. And when God remembers Abraham, he rescues Lot out of Sodom and Gomorrah. And again, we have it in Genesis 30:22 when God remembers Rachel in her barrenness and so opens her womb. And then we get it very significantly in the opening chapters of the book of Exodus, where God remembers his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and so acts to save his people out of slavery in Egypt. And so this language of God remembering, it's not a merely cognitive thing. It's not as if God forgot, it dropped out of his head. Oh yeah, thanks for the reminder. I better go and do something about that. That's not the way to read it. It's when God remembers somebody, God acts to save them, often on the basis of his prior commitment to them, on the basis of his covenant. And so that's this remembering language, which we're going to find recurring throughout Genesis and Exodus and then on into the biblical story. And so that's the key point that's being emphasized in the flood narrative, that in the midst of God's judgment on the world because of sin, God remembers his covenant and so acts to bring salvation. That's the big point. Now, there's some details on the matching scenes there in the literary contents, but for the sake of time, I'm going to let you read those and just draw attention to some of the key theological points that arise out of the flood narrative in Genesis 6 to 9. And let me think about how to order these. I think the first one is, well, let's just start here and notice how in Genesis 8:1, when God remembers Noah, God made a wind blow over the earth and the waters subsided. And the language here is really interesting. This word wind, this is ruach. This is the same word we had back in Genesis 1:2. Where the earth was without form and void, and the wind of God, or the Spirit of God, ruach, it's the same word, was hovering over the face of the waters. And so this co-location of wind plus the waters may make us think of Genesis 1. It takes us back to the original creation. And that sense is confirmed when we find that as the wind blows over the earth, the waters subside. And so the waters are divided. And as the waters subside, the ark comes to rest on the mountain of Ararat. And as we keep reading, we find that dry ground appears. And so we have the wind of God, the Spirit of God, parting the waters, dry ground appearing, and then a human being, Noah, appearing on the dry ground. And it takes us back conceptually into the original creation. And so this act of salvation that God brings to Noah in the midst of the flood is being pictured for us as a kind of new creation, a kind of new beginning in the world. And that's confirmed for us when we get to chapter 9 at the end of the flood. And God blesses Noah and says to and his sons and says to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And the echoes of Adam are unmistakable. And Noah's being pictured as a kind of second Adam at the beginning of a new creation on the other side of the flood. And so here we've got the theme of redemption as new creation, that when God acts to save Noah and to redeem the world, even in the face of sin, he does so not by abstracting Noah from the world. His salvation or his redemption is not opposed to the good order of the creation, which he established at the beginning, but is actually a vindication of the good order of the creation. The redemption takes the form of being a renewal of the creation. And that's going to be very significant for us in terms of the wider biblical theological trajectory, because we'll see that pattern everywhere across the Bible, all the way through to the end. That redemption takes the form of the renewal of the creation rather than the destruction of the creation or abstraction from the creation. And that then helps us to see also the form that the flood takes or the form that the judgment takes when God sends the judgment in the form of this flood because the earth is corrupt. The way it's described after the building of the ark here at the end of chapter 6, that's when we get to the beginning of chapter 7, is they come onto the ark and God sends rain on the earth because he's going to blot out all that is made from the face of the ground. And when God sends the flood, he opens the floodgates of the heavens. Where is this? On the 7-11. On that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened, and rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Again, this makes us think of back in Genesis 1, where God separated the sky from the waters above the sky and the waters below the sky. And so that ordering back in Genesis 1 is now being disordered. That the waters above the sky, the fountains of the windows of the heavens are being opened, and the fountains of the great deep are bursting forth. And so the separation of sky from water, which was part of God's ordering of the world back in Genesis 1, is now being undone. And so here we've got judgment as disorder, disordering of the creation. But then on the other side of that judgment, we have redemption as reordering or new creation. And that's a very significant theme that comes out of the flood for us. As part of that then, we see also God renewing his covenant with Noah. And just a few thoughts on the covenant, and then I'll give you a chance to ask questions about Noah and the flood. We noticed this already yesterday, but as Noah comes out as this new Adam figure and is commanded to be fruitful and multiply, it's in that context that God says again, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you. This is a repetition of the languages that was there at the beginning of the account in Genesis 6:18. And God establishes his covenant, meaning he maintains or confirms his existing arrangement. We presume, as I suggested yesterday, the maintenance of the covenant that he had at the beginning with Adam. And with every living creature that's with you, the birds, the livestock, and every beast that came out of the earth, as many of you came out of the ark, it's for every beast on the earth. And you can see how emphatic that is, that this covenant commitment that God has with Adam and now being reaffirmed with Noah is with Noah, but not just with Noah as an individual, with Noah as a representative leader of his offspring, his seed, those who come from him, but not just of his offspring, also of the other living creatures. And we get the categories from the creation account, the birds, the livestock, every beast on the earth. And then again, it's expanded even further, or perhaps just the same thing said in different words, when we have, I've set my bow in the cloud as a sign of the covenant, which is a covenant between me and the earth. And so what we're seeing here again is that God's commitment to bring redemption out of judgment involves the whole creation package, if you can put it like that. He's not going to save Noah on his own without the animals, but he's saving Noah with the animals. That's clear from the story itself, where the animals go into the ark with Noah. and he's saving Noah with the animals to live on the earth. That God is not going to leave behind the creation that he established in the beginning when he brings redemption in the face of sin, but instead he's going to vindicate it and renew it and restore it. And he's covenanting that shall be the case. There is, however, a significant development in the covenant, and we touched on this briefly yesterday when somebody asked about the continuity and development within the covenants, which is at the end of chapter 8, after Noah comes out of the ark. Noah builds an altar to the Lord, 8:20, and takes some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird and offers burnt offerings on the altar. And this is the first occurrence of this language of burnt offering, whole burnt offering, which we're going to have explained for us in Leviticus. In Leviticus chapter 1, we have the burnt offerings explained, and the burnt offering is the one which atones for sin, which turns aside wrath. And we have hints of that already here, because notice the order. Noah offers burnt offerings, and it's when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma. Then the Lord said in his heart, I'll never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. And so on the basis of this burnt offering, this sacrifice, God's wrath is turned aside. This is a propitiatory, a turning aside of wrath kind of offering, an atoning offering. And the reason for the flood in the first place, the intention of man's heart being evil, now becomes somehow the reason that God is going to preserve life on earth. And the only thing that's changed is is the offering, the sacrifice. You see that I'll never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Prior to the flood, that was the reason for sending the flood. But now, in the light of the sacrifice, God is going to persevere with humankind because the implication being their sin has been dealt with by this sacrifice. And so God says, never again will I strike down every living creature as I have done. And so you've got the covenant with Noah is a reaffirmation, a confirmation, a maintenance of the original covenant with Adam. But there's also this significant development. There's now been sacrifice introduced into the covenant in the wake of sin, which wasn't there in the very beginning prior to Adam's sin. And so while the goal of the covenant, as I said yesterday, remains the same, of life on earth and life with God, the means towards that goal has been significantly modified. It's no longer personal obedience as it was with Adam. There's now provision for sin by sacrifice. So there's the flood in short compass. There's obviously a lot more you could say. And so no doubt you've got some things you want to draw attention to or ask questions about.
It's interesting that there's the distinction of clean birds mentioned in this post the flood.
Yeah. Once you start looking for this, you notice it everywhere. That it seems, although the clean and unclean animals are not codified until Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14, right, in the law with Moses, it seems that Noah, a long time prior to Moses, knows about the law of clean and unclean. And in the same way, although we don't get the codification of burnt offerings until Leviticus chapter 1, Noah knows somehow to offer a burnt offering. And so this helps us with what we saw yesterday with Cain and Abel as well, that they offer different sacrifices which seem to match the different sacrifices in Leviticus. And Cain offers the sacrifice that turns aside sin. And so it seems like there's a knowledge of the law even before the law is codified at the time of Noah. And so I think we need to reckon with some kind of revelation to Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah, which is not recorded for us. So I don't want to make too much of it, but there does seem to be this knowledge of the law before the giving of the law.
I'm just thinking through the whole kind of storyline. So like you said, the genealogies are kind of, we're meant to be going, is this one going to be the seed of the woman? Is this one going to be the seed of the woman? And then you get Lamech kind of saying it's going to be Noah. And then you get the recreation account. And then you get 9 verse 20 and on.
Yeah.
Like if you go too far, it's almost like his fall, right? And it's like, okay, he wasn't the guy. Is that the kind of function?
Exactly right. I couldn't have put it better myself. In fact, if you look on page 7, I've got a little bit called Aftermath and Significance, and where I say almost exactly what you just said, but I think you said it better. This is like the fall. This is like the fall of Noah, where after the flood, we're at this real high point with the renewal of the covenant, and then they go forth from the ark. And then 9:20, Noah began to be a man of the soil. He plants a vineyard. He drank of wine and became drunk, and he lay uncovered in his tent. And you hear the echoes here. Noah ends up, his sons see him, and they see the nakedness of their father. And here's Noah naked and ashamed. And you think, oh, we've seen that before. And just as Noah's like Adam, in being blessed and being called to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, so Noah ends up like Adam, naked and ashamed. And you think, no, he's not the one. This is the fall of Noah. What that shows us is that God has not yet dealt with the heart of the problem, because the heart of the problem is the problem with the human heart. That's the heart of the problem. And the flood is a kind of cleansing judgment, right? God wipes out wickedness on the face of the earth by destroying those who are wicked. And Noah finds favor in his sight. But even Noah, who's blameless in his generation and who walks with God, still has a corrupt heart, and so falls into sin here, and ends up no better than Adam. And so God has not yet dealt with the heart of the problem, which is the problem with the human heart.
Just a quick one about the parallels between the covenant of works and the Noah covenant.
Yep.
What are they? And I guess you were mentioning before how Noah's got a bit of grace in there because it was God promising that he wouldn't destroy mankind.
Yep.
So I'm just it's a reestablishment of the Adam's covenant, but at the same time, it's something new in a way.
Correct. Yeah. So I think in terms of the categories that we get in the Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 7, about the covenants, I'd say the covenant with Noah as participating in the covenant of grace, and not the covenant of works. If you have to choose, it's part of the covenant of grace, not the covenant of works. Why? Because there's the key difference between the covenant of works and the covenant of grace in that systematic construction that we have in the confession, is that the covenant of works depends on Adam's personal obedience, whereas the covenant of grace depends on God's provision for sin through a mediator by sacrifice. And so when you put it like that, this covenant that God makes with Noah is of the latter kind. It's a gracious covenant. It's not a covenant of works. So the covenant with Noah participates in the covenant of grace. It's one of the administrations of the covenant of grace, I would say. But it's a reaffirmation of God's original commitment and God's original promise of life, which is there in the covenant of works as well. And so I think what we can see is that across all of the biblical covenants, beginning with the covenant with Adam and all the way through, the goal of the covenant is the same. That's the point of continuity. The goal is always the same, which is eternal life in God's presence. That's what God holds out to his people in covenant. Eternal life with him in the good world that he made. And that's why the Westminster Larger Catechism calls the original covenant with Adam the covenant of life, because that's the goal of it. What changes is the means by which that eternal life is offered. For Adam in the garden before the fall, eternal life is offered on the basis of personal, perpetual, entire, exact obedience. Right? That's language from the catechisms. It depends on Adam and his obedience. After the fall, it can't depend on human obedience anymore, because having fallen into sin, we're morally incapacitated and unable to save ourselves. And so it has to depend on God's gracious provision of grace through a mediator and through sacrifice. And so the means by which the eternal life comes to God's covenant partners is modified in the covenant of grace. And so the covenant with Noah reaffirms the original commitment of life. It's a reaffirmation of the original covenant in that sense. But because of the inclusion of sacrifice, it's actually a part of the covenant of grace. That's how I put it together. Any other thoughts, comments? Otherwise, we'll move to Babel.
Quite like the idea of seeing like this remnant theology come through and shine through of judgment, but then a preserved people for God that God brings about, a new people for himself. I just think that's really cool through the flood. You see those beginning ideas of remnant theology.
Yeah, absolutely. Well put. Yeah, there's a kind of salvation through judgment that occurs, and the salvation is of the remnant in the midst of the judgment on the rest. When we get to Babel, we have the same kinds of themes emerging of God's judgment on sin, and yet God's ongoing grace. And so Babel again has this same kind of structure to it, in that it's an extended chiasm. I've laid it out there for you in the notes on page 8, where in scene 1 we have humankind travelling, matched by scene 5, humankind scattered. Scene 2, humankind plans to build a tower in a city. Scene 4, God plans to frustrate humankind. Scene 3, God comes down to inspect the building. And that's really tightly grounded in the text. So bottom of page 8, I've laid that out, and you get these matching sections in the text, where in verse 1, we get the whole earth had one language and the same words. And that's matched in verse 9 at the end, where we get the Lord had confused the language of all the earth. So a repetition of some of the key words. And then in verse 2, we get this emphatic demonstrative. As the people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And that's matched by verse 7 on the other side, where come, let us go down and there confuse their language, says God, so they may not understand one another's speech. And then in verse 4, the human fear of being scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. Let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth, is realized in God's judgment when in verse 8, they're dispersed, same language, over the face of the whole earth. And so by the repetition of these key terms on either side of the chiasm, the pattern is established. And again, what that does is draw our attention to the middle, to the scene 3, at the center of the chiasm, which is verse 5. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And as Wenham points out, I think I noticed this earlier, there's a kind of comedy in this, in that they're building a tower with its top in the heavens, but God has to come down. They're trying to reach up to heaven, but they get nowhere near it. And so God has to come down in order to inspect their tower, because he can't even see it from the heights of his heaven. So pitiful is it. What's wrong? Sorry, is there a comment there?
I just wondered if that sort of humour, if you like, perspective carries on into verse 6 with the part, and nothing they propose to do will now be impossible to them. It's like,
Yeah, there's kind of an irony in what God says there. Yeah, I think you're probably right. It's emphasizing God's sovereignty over against the pitiful efforts of humankind. What have they done wrong? Isn't this just innocent culture building? Well, there's at least 3 things they've done wrong. One, they want to make a name. You see in what they say. Here's their confession of sin right here. Come, let's build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. They're wanting to reach up into God's space. God created us for the earth, not for the heavens. He made Adam from the ground and planted him in the garden and gave him dominion over the earth. There's no, sometimes we say that God gave Adam dominion over the whole creation. That's not strictly true. That in Genesis 1, there's no dominion given over the stars and the planets and the sun and the moon. It's dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and every living thing that moves upon the earth. So we're created from the earth and for the earth. And yet here we have humankind wanting to reach up to the heavens. They're wanting to break into God's domain. They're wanting to become like God, as the serpent put it back in chapter 3. So that's the first thing. There's a lack of right humility before their creator. And that comes out in the second thing. They want to make a name for themselves. When we get to Abram, we're going to find that God promises to make a name for him. That's God's business, to make a name for someone. But here, these tower builders want to make a name for themselves rather than glorying in God's name and calling on the name of the Lord as the God they've done in the genealogy. Now they're making a name for themselves. And third, they're wanting to be secure from being dispersed over the face of the earth, which is the exact opposite of what God had commanded them, which was to fill the earth and subdue it. They were meant to spread abroad and fill the earth with godly human image bearers, and instead they're wanting to gather in one place in rebellion against God. And so God comes down to see the city and brings his judgment upon them and disperses them and confuses their language. And so the place is called Babel. And yet, as I've mentioned, on the other side of this judgment, there's the renewed hope in the generations of Shem, which brings us through to Abraham and God's fivefold blessing of Abraham on the other side of the curse. So just a couple of final comments drawing out of the biblical theological perspective notes on page 11 and following before we take a short break. We've already mentioned a lot of this, so I'll just draw attention to the categories and you can read some of the details later on, and maybe I'll make a few comments here. In terms of the theme of God's kingdom, we've got here in the flood account the theme of God's kingdom coming by salvation through judgment. God exercises his authority in the world. God works to establish his kingdom by judging his enemies and saving his people. And that's what we see in the flood, this salvation through judgment pattern, which is going to continue all the way through the Bible, that when God saves his people, he also simultaneously judges his enemies. And the climax of that is going to be on the cross, where we get salvation coming through judgment as Jesus takes God's judgment on sin, but also brings salvation for those who belong to him. But that's a theme that runs all the way through the Bible. And Jim Hamilton's written a whole biblical theology, God's glory in salvation through judgment, drawing attention to this theme and the way that it gets developed all the way through. We've talked about God's covenant with Noah, so I won't repeat that. We've talked about the flood as a type of the new creation. So I won't talk about that except to show you in 2 Peter 3, the way in which Peter draws out the significance of the flood, where Peter talks about the coming judgment. And he draws attention to these scoffers. This is 2 Peter 3, and who say that ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things are continuing as they were from the creation. But they deliberately overlook this fact that the heavens existed long ago and the earth was formed out of water and through water by the word of God, and that by means of these, the world that then existed was deluged with water and perished. He's talking about the flood of Noah. The world that then existed was deluged with water and perished. And then he says, by the same word, the heavens and earth that now exist are stored up for fire, being kept until the day of judgment and destruction of the ungodly. And you see here he's drawing a parallel between the destruction and the judgment of the flood and the judgment that is yet to come by fire. And that helps us to understand the nature of the judgment. That it's not going to bring about an absolute annihilation of the good world that God has made. We see in the case of the flood, it was deluged with water and the world perished, but perished in the sense that life on earth apart from Noah perished, not in the sense that the cosmos was annihilated and that God started again from scratch. The world after the flood was materially continuous with the world prior to the flood. Right? It was a radical cleansing judgment, but not an annihilation and then a new creation from nothing after the flood. Right? It was a renewal of the existing creation. And Peter draws attention to that as the model for the coming judgment. By the same word, the heavens and earth that now exist are stored up for fire, being kept until the judgment of that day and the destruction of the ungodly. And so the pattern is, we're told, will repeat at the final judgment, when God, like at the time of Noah and the flood, God will destroy the ungodly. But out the other side of that, we're looking forward to a new heavens and a new earth, which in the context of the flood can't mean a brand new heavens and new earth from scratch, but a renewed heavens and a renewed earth. I'm looking for that language here. Where is it? The new heavens and the new earth where righteousness is at home, in verse 13. We're waiting for a new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells, which is the renewal of the creation through the cleansing judgment of fire. Just as we saw with Noah, the renewal of the creation through the cleansing judgment of the flood. And so all the way through, we find God's commitment to the original creation. And that commitment exhibits itself in his commitment to remove sin from his world, but also in his commitment to renew the world that he's made. Then finally, God's son Noah is the new Adam. We've talked about that. And therefore Noah is a kind of type of Christ. We get lots of new Adams all the way through. We're going to find other Adams along the way, but Noah is the first of them, until we get to the last Adam, the final Adam in Christ. And then finally in the Tower of Babel, just one thing to notice here is that, let's say two things actually. One is that Babel functions the whole way down through the biblical story as a symbol for human society organized against God. That's what Babel is. It's human society organized. It's people organizing themselves atheistically, wanting to advance culture and develop human society without reference to God, opposed to God and his purposes, rejecting God's revealed will. And so we get actual Babylon as the enemy of God's people at the time of the exile. But then when we get into the New Testament, Babel or Babylon becomes the symbol of any human society opposed to God. And so in the book of Revelation, we get Rome pictured as Babylon or as Babel because it's human society organized against God. And so Babel is that symbol of human beings trying to live in the world without reference to God, opposed to God and his revealed will. That's the first thing to note. On the other side, it's important to note that when God reverses the effects of Babel, he does more than merely reverse them. You think about the day of Pentecost, and sometimes we say on the day of Pentecost, when the Spirit comes down and the apostles declare the mighty acts of God in the languages of all the people who are assembled there in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost. Is that the reversal of Babel? Well, it's not really the reversal of Babel, because the reversal of Babel would be everyone returning to speak the same language. It's better to speak about it as the redemption of Babel, where this curse that God brings on the world at the time of Babel to confuse their languages then becomes a means of blessing as the good news of what God has done in Christ gets proclaimed in all sorts of different languages. And so the different languages which begin as a curse in God's gracious providence become the means of blessing and of the gospel going out to the nations, so that when we get to the vision of the new heavens and the new earth in the book of Revelation, then people are not all speaking one language. It's not a return to before Babel. It's out the other side into something even better, which is that we have people of every tribe and people and nation and language around the throne declaring God's praise, Revelation 5, Revelation 7. And so God doesn't merely reverse the effects of his curse on sin, but somehow works to redeem them and to take them up and use them as a means of blessing in his purposes. Comments, questions? And then we need to take a little break.
Just a little comment. So is space travel anti-God?
Good question. Interesting you picked up on those echoes. I'm having this conversation with my son at the moment because he wants to be an astrophysicist and he's very excited about Elon Musk and getting to Mars. And yeah, I wouldn't say it's necessarily opposed to God, but I'm still thinking this through. So you think about it for yourself. But I've been increasingly noticing the way in which Scripture is very focused on the earth and God's purposes for the earth, and doesn't in any way encourage us to try to control or inhabit the heavens. That's just not our destiny. We're created from the earth and for the earth. When we're raised to new life, we're raised in resurrected bodies. Jesus is going to return to us on the earth. At the end, the new heaven, the new Jerusalem comes down out of heaven. So the dwelling of God is now with men. God comes down to dwell with us at the end. So I don't see any encouragement in Scripture for us to be trying to inhabit the heavens. That's just not what we're created for. So I'm not sure yet I'd go so far as to say it's sinful or wrong, but maybe I'd say it's misdirected, and that the resources that are being put into it could better be used to care for life on earth. I know that'll be controversial. My son doesn't like it, and maybe you'll think of arguments against it, but that's where my thinking on that question is heading at the moment.
Good. That will create interesting dinner time conversation tonight. I have a son who's very much into space and space, maybe not travel, but space objects.
Yeah. So I think there's different ways you can approach it, aren't there? There's observation of the heavens and learning about the cosmos that God has made. I think that's a different thing from wanting to colonize or inhabit the heavens. So the heavens declare the glory of God. So studying the cosmos as a means of understanding the glory of God, I think we can find a good space for that in a biblical theology. But wanting to travel to the heavens in order to inhabit and colonize them, that's going another step, perhaps. Let's take a break. It's 7:48, let's say 7:50 in Sydney. That makes 9:50 over your way. So let's come back at 5:02.
Right, thank you. Oh, time for that cup of tea.
Okay, looks like some people have got their coffee. I've got mine.
I was hearing a completely different podcast this morning on patriarchy. So there's another.
Okay, we'll get back into it. And we're picking up now with Abraham, or Abram first, in Genesis 12. And we're going to try and survey the rest of Genesis 12 to 50. We will take our morning tea break at the allotted time in about 35 minutes. We may not have finished our survey, this lecture, our survey of Genesis 12 to 50 by then. So we'll just cut off whenever we need to for the sake of time, and then perhaps pick up and finish off any pieces that we haven't gotten to after morning tea. And that's fine. We can make up the time as we work through Exodus in the second couple of sections later today. So picking up with Abram and now starting to increase in the pace in which we're moving through the text, you're going to feel more like we're seeing less of the text and getting more of the bird's eye view. So let's start with the big picture of Genesis 12 to 50, where I'll put it on the screen here in Genesis 12, 1 to 3. We have a real focus on one man, Abram. The Lord had said to him, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I'll make of you a great nation, and I'll bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And there's a definite development in the narrative of Genesis here, where if we started with the broadest possible horizon, with the heavens and the earth in Genesis 1:1, the entire cosmos, and then we've been tracing in Genesis 1 to 11 what's sometimes called the primeval history, that is the history of the ancient world with, again, that very broad lens on the camera. A flood, which it seems covers the whole earth, the genealogy of humankind from Adam onwards, the generations of the heavens and the earth, Genesis 2:4. What happens now is as we've been traveling along and tracing the genealogy, we've been narrowing in, following one line. And we've noticed that already in the genealogies, but it really comes to a head here, because in the genealogies, of course, you notice such and such had a son who is named for us, and then he had other sons and daughters who are not named for us. And so we get the sense that humankind is increasing on the earth, but we're just being told one segment of the story. We're tracing one family line in particular, and that becomes particularly clear here when we get to Abram. And the story really zeroes in on Abram and his descendants. And the whole rest of the book, Genesis 12 to 50, is going to focus on this one family, Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob, then Joseph. And it can feel like this grand vision of the heavens and the earth and all the nations has narrowed to just one paltry little family. Has God given up on the wider vision? Has God given up on the heavens and the earth? Has God given up on all the families of the earth? Well, it might feel like that, but only for a second, because as soon as we start to read the Lord's promise to Abram, we find in verse 3 here that God is focusing in on Abram and his descendants, and God is going to bless them and intends to make of them a great nation, so that, verse 3, in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And so we do have this narrowing in on the line of promise, but it remains with the purpose that all the families on the earth shall be blessed. This is recognized even in early Jewish tradition. So the Genesis Rabbah, which is a commentary, a kind of Jewish commentary on Genesis from the early centuries AD, it has God, puts words in God's mouth at this point. In Genesis Rabbah 14:6, I've quoted on the notes for you there. God says, "I'll make Adam first, and if he goes astray, I'll send Abraham to sort it out." And that's quite a good insight into the way in which the story of Genesis works, that Adam does go astray, and God raises up Abram and covenants with Abram and promises to bless Abram, so that the problems that were introduced with Adam can be overcome, so that sin and the curse and death can be overcome in the blessing that comes through Abraham to all the families on the earth. So that's the big picture. Let's now put on our historical lens, which we only have some very brief comments to make, and then we'll work our way through Genesis 12 to 50. From the historical point of view, there's much less to say here than we've seen in the earlier chapters, and that's because we have no parallel accounts for the life of Abraham or for Isaac or for Jacob. We do have some points of contact for Joseph in Egypt, which we'll get to a little bit later on. But for the major period of the patriarchs, we don't have other written accounts for life in the land where Abraham and Isaac and Jacob are living. The period we're dealing with is probably somewhere around 2000 to 1800 BC. And so that places Abraham and his immediate descendants in the archaeological periods known as Middle Bronze 1 and Middle Bronze 2A. And so we can match up the kinds of lifestyles that are described of the patriarchs in Genesis with the limited archaeological evidence that we've got from this period. And the match is good. The archaeological evidence indicates that the land was sparsely settled. There seems to have been some movement from semi-nomadic lifestyles because you get artifacts that seem to have been produced in one place that turn up in other places. There are fortified cities, though we shouldn't think of major urban sprawl like Sydney or New York or Shanghai. A city could be just a few hundred people in this period in history. And there are local strongmen who we'll call kings because that's what the narrative calls them. But again, we shouldn't think of a king over a nation state. Rather, it's a local strongman who controls a reasonably large tract of land, who can raise large numbers of livestock, and who can summon armies of several hundred soldiers. You see that when Abraham goes to defeat the 5 kings with 318 armed men, and that gives you a sense of the size in Genesis 14. Abraham's got 318 men and he defeats these 5 kings. And we're not told how many men they have, but it's not in the millions. It's likely to be each of them has a similar number of men to Abraham. And so we're talking an army in the hundreds or perhaps the thousands, but not more than that. So the kind of life that we can reconstruct from the archaeological evidence matches with the kind of life that we have described for us of the patriarchs in Genesis, but we don't have a lot of detail. Genesis really is our only source for the life of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob.
So, Murray, is it fair to, absolutely adds no value to the story, but is it fair to suggest that Abraham was quite a physical man of stature and, would have had that commanding presence much like those other 5 kings? As opposed to thinking of Abraham always as this old man with a beard.
Right, yeah, no, I mean, he's got Genesis 14, he raises an army. Let me just read it for you. Genesis 14, where is it? When Abram heard, Genesis 14:14, when Abram heard that his kinsmen had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men. Really interesting language there. That implies that this is not just an ad hoc thing, but they've done some training. What exactly, what form that took, we don't know. And he went in pursuit as far as Dan, and he divided his forces. Again, this is military language, against them by night, he and his servants. And he defeated them and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. And then he brought back all the possessions. So yeah, Abram has trained men. He has forces. They can organize themselves in battle formation. We learn when he comes out of Egypt in Genesis 13 that he comes out with great wealth of silver and gold and livestock. So he's a significant figure, yes. He's not just some hillbilly old man. He's quite a powerful, wealthy figure who's able to raise an army according to the standards of his day, which we've just outlined.
So can you see Abram at this point as someone who's also alluding to a prophet, king, priest function?
Yeah, excellent. He certainly is all of those 3, and he's also a kind of new Adam, but that's getting ahead of ourselves. So great point. How about we get into working through it, and we'll draw out some of those things as we go. In terms of the literary form, I've suggested a couple of times now that I think in Genesis we have a kind of, the whole thing is historical narrative, but there is a development in the genre as we go. We start with a kind of prologue in chapter 1, which is history on the grandest scale, the history of the cosmos, we can put it like that. And then, as I've pointed out, we get the introduction of these are the generations, the Toledot formula, which occurs the first time in Genesis 2:4. And then we get the generations of the heavens and the earth. And then from Genesis 5 onwards, we get the generations, these are the generations of Adam, a particular named individual, of course, Adam from the creation account. And as we go through Genesis, the genre becomes more and more historical narrative. We go from perhaps grand narrative and proto-history into historical narrative of an ancient kind with Abraham. And so with Abraham, we get names and dates and places in a way that we haven't had in the narrative up until now. There are families that live in particular locations. There are journeys where we go from one spot to another. It's been more impressionistic history, if I can put it like that, not wanting to disparage it in any way in Genesis 1 to 11. It's painted with broader brushstrokes, let's put it like that, in Genesis 1 to 11. Whereas when we get to Genesis 12 and following, the history is painted with finer brushstrokes. We get more historical detail. And so there's this kind of genre development that occurs. And here we're very clearly in the genre of historical narrative. And so it's presented to us with the intention that we understand it as people who really existed, events that really happened, places where they really visited. Come over now to the literary contents. I'm on page 16, if you're following along. And let's get into the story. And here we've already read Genesis 12, 1 to 3, the promise, but this really sets the trajectory for the whole of the rest of Genesis 12 to 50. And so it's worth just dwelling on it for a couple of minutes longer, where we see when the Lord makes this promise to Abram, he calls Abram to go from his country and his kindred and his father's house to the land that God will show him. And God is going to make him a great nation, and God is going to bless him. And so you see here, God is calling Abram from his father's house and the land that he would have inherited from his father to a land that God will give to him, and to blessing and an inheritance that God will provide for him. And so God is taking on the role of father in Abram's life. Abram is forsaking his earthly father and following God as his father, and hoping to receive, being promised to receive an inheritance from God, which is what you receive from your father. And so Abram here, again, although the word is lacking, Abram is pictured as a kind of son of God. He's picking up that role of son of God that Adam had very explicitly, and now Abram is taking on that role of son of God, who's going to receive inheritance from God. And so then we see all sorts of little echoes of Adam and Son of God in the narrative. I've got an exercise there that we'll skip for the sake of time. But as you go through this narrative in Genesis 12 and 13, we find Abram who hears the word of God here. And so there's a kind of prophetic function as God speaks to him. And that comes out even more strongly in subsequent chapters. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, Genesis 15. So he has this kind of prophetic role as son of God. But as he goes, he comes eventually to the land of Canaan, and he passes through the land, and the Lord appears to him and says, to your offspring, I'll give this land. And so he builds an altar to the Lord. And as he goes throughout the land, he builds other altars to the Lord, and he calls upon the name of the Lord. And here Abram's taking on a priestly kind of role, building altars and calling on the name of the Lord. So he's a prophet, and he's also a priest as son of God. And you're expecting what's coming next, and somebody's already asked the question. He does come out in the narrative as a kind of king as well, as he goes down to Egypt. There's the story with Sarah. And when he comes out of Egypt, Pharaoh deals well with him for Sarah's sake. And he comes out with sheep and oxen and male donkeys and male and female servants and camels. And then eventually even he comes out with gold Where's that? Abram went up out of Egypt, he and his wife, and all the land into the Negeb. And Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. That's the first time gold's been mentioned in the narrative of Genesis since the gold that was in the ground in the Garden of Eden. And so you put all of that together, this wealth and livestock and the possession of gold. And then in chapter 14, when he marshals the army and fights against the 5 kings, and we've got Abraham not only as prophet and priest, but also as a kind of kingly figure. And I say a kind of kingly figure because he's not called a king, he's not called here a prophet, he's not called a priest, but he's performing those kinds of prophet, priest, and kingly roles. And he's receiving God's blessing that he'll be fruitful and multiply. And so he's a new Adam, a son of God, who is simultaneously a kind of prophet, priest, and king. And what we're meant to learn from that is that this is God persisting with his plan. This is how God's kingdom is going to come in the world. It's going to be through the kingdom of his son, who is prophet, priest, and king. The details of the promise are also significant. Back in chapter 12, where God promises him, I'll make of you a great nation and blessing, and he's going to do that in the land that I will show you. And there's 2 elements there to this promise. There's the land that I will show you, and there's the nation that God will fill that land with. And so again, we've got echoes of the creation account where God created the spaces and then filled them with life. And here now God is going to give Abram the land and fill it with life with his descendants. And it's those 2 promises that really are highlighted in what goes forward and throughout the whole of the rest of Genesis 12 to 50. It's land and nation, place and people. You see that, for example, in Genesis 15, when God confirms these promises to Abram. The word of the Lord comes to him, fear not, Abram, I'm your shield, your reward shall be very great. And Abram immediately asks about the promise of offspring, of descendants, of a nation. Oh, Lord God, what will you give me, for I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus, and not his son. Behold, you've given me no offspring and no seed, and a member of my household will be my heir. But the word of the Lord came to him, this man shall not be your heir, your very own son shall be your heir. And he brought him outside and repeats the promise in expanded form. I'll make of you a great nation, God said in chapter 12. Now look towards heaven and number the stars. If you're able to number them, so shall your offspring be. And Abram believed the Lord, and God counted it to him as righteousness. So here's the repetition of the promise of offspring or of nation. And then parallel with that, paired with that, I'm the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans, Genesis 15:7, to give you this land to possess, right? So offspring and land, people and place. But Abram said, oh, Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? And so God enters into this covenant with him, which we'll talk about again in a minute, to give him the land. And so these 2 promises of people and a place, of offspring and a land, of land and nation. They're the 2 great promises that God makes to Abram, and they're the 2 that are going to both echo the earlier promise or the earlier design of God with Adam, and where God created spaces and then filled them with life. And they're going to structure the rest of the story with Isaac and Jacob, and then into Joseph, and then even into the Exodus and further on. So any comments, questions, clarifications about this initial promise?
Interesting, the amount of threats that come against these promises, or seeming threats that come to them throughout the narrative of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
As these promises going to come to fulfillment, oh, now we have someone who's barren. And it just goes to show, without the work of God fulfilling his promises, if it left be to man, then nothing will happen.
Yeah.
Going back to Genesis 3 and all those things. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Well put. That's actually what it's the threats to these promises that drive the rest of the narrative, Genesis 12 to 50. Sarah is barren. Rebecca is barren. Rachel is barren. that all of the wives of the patriarchs who are going to have offspring as many as the stars in the sky can't bear children. And yet God brings about his promises. And repeatedly and really quickly, we get a threat to the land promise as well. So that's a threat to the offspring promise. Threat to the land promise is also here because very quickly here in Genesis 12, where there's a famine and in the land, right? There's a famine in the land. And so Abram goes down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. And so immediately after he's been promised this land, he leaves the land and goes down to Egypt, which is not the land that's been promised him. So yeah, threats to the promise, both of land and of offspring the whole way through, threats which God repeatedly overcomes. That's the story of Genesis 12 to 50. And we can have confidence that God is going to overcome the threats to the promise because of God's covenant. So let's talk about that now for a few moments in Genesis 15. Where we've read little bits of this already. What's happening here is in Genesis 12, God makes these promises to Abram, and they're not yet formalized in a covenant, but it's the beginning of a process that is now formalized as covenant in Genesis 15. And so this covenant is not really anything additional to the initial promise in Genesis 12. It's just a formalization of the initial promise in Genesis 12. And you see that here in what I pointed out, that the things under discussion are exactly the things that God had promised, the offspring in the land. And when Abram questions God, why have you not given me offspring? God answers merely by repeating the promise, but repeating the promise in escalated form. He shows him the number of the stars. So shall your offspring be. It's simply the word of God that guarantees the promise. And Abram is a model of faith because he trusts the promise of God. Verse 6, he believed the Lord and he counted it to him as righteousness. And as you know, that's the verse that Paul quotes in Romans and Galatians to point out the dynamics of the covenant where God makes promises and his people trust him and obey. And Abram is the model covenant partner here as he believes the Lord, and God therefore counts it to him as righteousness. And then you get the land promise, and in the same way, Abram asks, "Oh Lord, how am I to know that I shall possess it?" And the short answer is God says, "Because I say so, because I've promised." But God confirms that promise with a covenant. And so he says to Abram, "Bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove and a young pigeon." Abram brings them all and he cut them in half and laid each half over against the other. So you have to picture two sets of animals that have been cut in half and half of the animal bodies on one side and half the animal bodies on the other side, and a kind of aisle or corridor between the two. He laid each half over against the other. He didn't cut the birds in half. And then as the sun goes down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. And the Lord said to Abram in his sleep, notice, "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that's not theirs. They'll be servants there. They'll be afflicted for 400 years. This is the time in Egypt. But I will bring judgment on the nation they serve, and afterwards they'll come out with great possessions." Abram's experience in Egypt back in chapters 12 and 13 anticipates the experience of the nation as a whole. Just as Abram went down into Egypt and came out with great possessions, so the nation, his descendants, are going to go down into Egypt and come out with great possessions. "But as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You'll be buried at a good old age, and they'll come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete." So what's God saying? Abram asks, "How can I know that I'll inherit the land?" And God says, "Because I've promised." "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners, but they will come back here in the 4th generation." And so when the sun had gone down and it was dark, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between the pieces. This is the manifestation of God's presence to Abram, the smoking fire pot and the flaming torch. Here we've got smoke or cloud and fire, which are often paired all the way through the Bible as the ways in which God manifests his presence. You've only got to think of Sinai where God and the wilderness wanderings, where God manifests his presence in a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire, or God comes down on Sinai and the mountain smokes and seems to be a flame, or the burning bush, or the fire that comes down from heaven at the time of Elijah, or the fire that accompanies the presence of the Holy Spirit on the day of Pentecost. This is clearly a manifestation of God passing between the pieces. And so then we read, on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, cut a covenant. This is new language we haven't had before. The Lord cut a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I give this land. Has he said anything new? No, it's exactly the same promise. It's the same promise now confirmed and formalized in covenant. To your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Canaanites, etc. And so God confirms his promises of offspring and land in this formalized covenant. And what's really significant that we mustn't miss here is that Abram is asleep when the covenant is sealed. That's absolutely crucial. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and great darkness fell upon him. And so then, although Abram has laid out the animal pieces, it's not Abram, but it's the smoking firepot and the flaming torch that passes between the pieces. This is a covenant ceremony that we have records of in other ancient Near Eastern texts, but more importantly, we have a record of this kind of covenant ceremony in Jeremiah, where God is indicting the people. This is Jeremiah 34. Jeremiah 34 on the screen now, where God says, I made a covenant with your fathers. And then he talks about a covenant that the people had made with each other. And he talks about the way in which they made that covenant. And I thought I was in the right spot, but yes, here we go. In Genesis, this is Jeremiah 34, where God says, the men who transgressed my covenant and did not keep the terms of the covenant that they made before me, I will make them like the calf that they cut in two and passed between its parts. You see the correspondence there? Here we've got the same kind of covenant ceremony of a calf that's been cut in two, and the people who are making the covenant pass between its parts. The officials of Judah, the officials of Jerusalem, the eunuchs, the priests, and all the people in the land who passed between the parts of the calf. I'll give them into the hand of their enemies and into the hand of those who seek their lives. Their dead bodies shall be food for the birds and the air of the beasts of the earth. And so what we learn from that is that the way this covenant symbolism works is that the animals are cut in two, and the parties to the covenant walk between the broken pieces. And that's symbolizing the curse that will come upon the person who breaks the covenant. As you walk through the pieces of the covenant, through the pieces of the animals, what you're saying is, may God do this to me. May I become like these animals that are cut in two if I break the covenant, if I don't perform what I'm obligated to do by the terms of this covenant. And so it's a way of confirming a promise in very graphic terms, in life and death terms. And so that makes it really significant that here, as God seals his covenant, God cuts his covenant with Abraham. Abram doesn't pass between the pieces, but God does. You see that? And so God is taking upon himself the responsibility to bear the curses of the covenant if the covenant should be broken. Now, of course, there's no question that God will break his covenant. He's the Lord of heaven and earth. He's the faithful God. And so God is taking upon himself the responsibility for the covenant should it be broken even by Abram or his descendants. Even if Abram or his descendants fail to keep their part of the covenant with God, God will remain faithful and will himself bear the curses that the broken covenant deserves. And I think that's very graphically and very clearly pictured for us here in Abram being asleep while God manifesting his presence in the fire pot and the flaming torch passes between the pieces. And it's on that basis that Abram can be certain that God will multiply his offspring and that they will fill the land. It's because God has ratified it through this covenant ceremony and confirmed his promise in this very graphic way. So any comments or questions about that, God's covenant with Abram?
So if it's God who's going to take the curse and Abraham and his descendants won't take the curse, isn't exile part of the curse?
Yeah, they'll certainly suffer elements of the curse, but they won't ultimately suffer the curse of, because the curse of the covenant is, in the day you eat of it, you shall surely die. It's eternal death, it's spiritual death. And so we get in the Israel as a type of the people of God suffer historical manifestations of curse. Yes, certainly, to teach us what sin, to show what sin deserves. But the faithful remnant, this is where we've got to do our biblical theology, the faithful remnant in Israel and the faithful in the new covenant don't suffer the full force of the curse in its final manifestation, that is in the form of final spiritual death and condemnation before God. So there's, yes, elements of the curse, maybe we can put it like that will come upon them, but not the final manifestation of the curse in eternal death and separation from God.
But Maury, also exile doesn't mean that the covenant is made void, right? So there's always the idea that even when you get sent to exile, if you repent, God will receive you back. So it's like the covenant's still there, like it's not invalidated by people's disobedience.
Yeah, that's right. We can certainly say that we'll talk about this when we get to Deuteronomy, where we get this, exile as the curse of the covenant in Deuteronomy 30. But yes, I think we have to say the people break the covenant, no doubt about that, and therefore they deserve the curses of the covenant. But God will remain faithful. That there's this asymmetry. So the covenant is broken. Even at the golden calf incident, it's clear that the people break the covenant by worshipping the golden calf. And so Moses comes down the mountain, and we'll see this later today, and smashes the 2 tablets of stone that have the 10 commandments, the covenant on them. So the people break the covenant, but God, being gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in love, is always ready to renew the covenant. And so there's always hope on the other side of covenant breach because of God's covenant faithfulness. Okay, that might be a good place for us to have morning tea. We've had a look at God's covenant with Abram, the promises to Abram of land and people, and then God's sealing of that with the covenant in Genesis 15. When we come back, we'll spend a bit of time tracing out those themes through the rest of Genesis more briefly, and then we'll make our way into Exodus. But let's have a good break now for morning tea, get some energy back, have something to eat, grab a coffee or whatever you like. It's 10:30, so we'll come back at 11 o'clock. I'll see you then.